Ishmael. Ishmael is the son of the Egyptian slave Hagar and the firstborn son of Abraham. He came about because Abraham's wife Sarah wanted to fulfill the promise God gave to the couple, but they were ancient. Sarah passed the age of having children, choosing the young, beautiful Hagar as her replacement. Sarah had begun to resent Ishmael's mother Hagar since he was born, reaching a boiling point when Sarah had her own child with Abraham, God's promised son Isaac. Because of this, Hagar and Ishmael were sent away into the wilderness of Beersheba, with a small supply of water and bread, happening when Ishmael was at least 13 years old. The origin story concerning Ishmael is covered in Genesis 16 and Genesis 21, verses 9 to 21. The final verses 20 and 21 confirm that Ishmael became an archer, lived in Paran, and married an Egyptian woman selected by Hagar as mother. Ishmael isn't mentioned again until Genesis 25 verse 9, where he's recorded mourning with and helping his half-brother Isaac bury their father Abraham in the cave of Machpelah. Abraham was gifted this cave and the land surrounding it in Genesis 23, next to his wife Sarah. Verses 12 to 18 of the same chapter document that Ishmael passed aged 137. It also confirms Ishmael had 12 sons, or princes as they are called in verse 16, named Nebahoth, Cedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Dumah, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jether, Naphish, and Sedemah. The last mention of Ishmael is in Genesis 28 verse 9, when Isaac's oldest son Esau marries Ishmael's daughter Mahaphalah. God blesses Ishmael in Genesis 16:10-12 and Genesis 17:20. The blessing from Genesis 16 is given to Hagar his mother through the angel of the Lord, after she fled from Sarah for the first time. In the blessing, God commanded her to name her son Ishmael, meaning God hears, yet the rest of his promise has been interpreted as negative by some modern believers. However, doing some research, it seems Hagar and Ishmael would have seen it positively. The phrase wild donkey of a man sounds harsh, yet in biblical times donkeys represented freedom, which to a slave like Hagar, knowing your son would never be under anyone's control, would be comforting to both. The next two lines, his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, are the only lines in the blessing that sound negative. However, they could be metaphoric, meaning that Ishmael would not be accountable to anyone. He wouldn't be under anyone like a slave, or over anyone like a master. He would be independent and free, as his mother would want him to be. Finally, the last line, and he will live to the east of all his brothers, has been translated differently in various versions of the Bible, but this part is interpreted to contain the same themes as before, cementing the freedom and independence of Ishmael, and all pleasing for Hagar. Genesis 17:20 is the moment when God promises to create a great nation from Ishmael's descendants, since he too is Abraham's offspring. God's promise concerning Isaac sounds quite similar to this. Both would be exceedingly fruitful, and their descendants would become great nations. The only differences are that Isaac wasn't promised how many children he would have, yet Ishmael was promised 12, and that Isaac would become kings and Ishmael's princes. The kings and princes, I believe, mean that Isaac's nation will be greater than Ishmael's, as kings rule over princes. Returning to the 12 sons promised to Ishmael, this is fulfilled in Genesis 25 verses 13-16, and interestingly, Isaac's son Jacob would have 12 sons too. These sons would interact with some of Ishmael's descendants in Genesis 37:28, when they sold Joseph to a group of Ishmaelite traders, showing that God's promise to Ishmael was coming true. In conclusion, Ishmael is a forgotten but important character in the biblical story. Despite not being mentioned outside the book of Genesis, apart from the genealogies in 1 Chronicles 1, and alluded to by Paul in Galatians 4:22, God promised Ishmael to become a great nation like his half-brother Isaac, who through Jacob and his 12 sons became Israel, and Ishmael through his 12 sons would become the Ishmaelite people, though the two peoples were hostile toward each other, confirmed in Psalm 83, and the fulfillment of an interpretation of God's promise to Hagar. Yet another conclusion, the conclusion discussed before, says God's promise means Ishmael and his descendants would be free and independent. So we'll have to see if these two can reconcile their differences and live as a family.